Welcome to Examining U.S. India Relations. This is a half-day conference as part of our series honoring Naren Gupta, an advisory board member who has brought many of the organizations participating here today together. We have a terrific lineup for you, 4 sessions with a tea break and food in between. We're going to cover policy, cross-border investments, Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship, tech, and innovation, all critical issues to the U.S.-India relationship and all issues important to Naren. We could not have done this without our partners, TIE and Indiaspora, both organizations that have been dear to Naren's heart, and we're going to be hearing from them today. Welcome to our members, our advisory board, our community partners, and our sponsors. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our Northern California Center, and I'm joined by my team today. We are a team of 6 here organizing this for you. Thank you for being with us. This event is on the record. We are recording, and videos will be available in about a week on our website after this event. So, thank you, and let's go ahead and get started. Our first session is a keynote on U.S.-India relations. That's with Tanvi Madan of Brookings. She is joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. Our speaker bios are on our website. You can get to that by the QR code that's on these boards in the room. There's also going to be a QR code up on the slides behind me, and you can get all the details of all the extraordinary achievements that Tanvi has done in her career. Tanvi will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand, wait for a microphone to be brought to you. If Tanvi calls on you, please introduce yourself and then ask your question. And let's go ahead and get started. Please join me in welcoming Tanvi.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to the Asia Society of Northern California. It's really great for me to be here, always is, in Silicon Valley, partly because one of the things not on my bio is that my first job, even though I'm now a kind of a foreign policy specialist, my first job was actually in India's Silicon Valley in Bangalore, my first paid job, where I coded websites at the time that you still had to do that by writing out HTML, and then I learned how to be a graphic designer as well. And I'm always kind of, where these things are connected is it does keep coming back. Having worked in that kind of tech space, it comes back these days more and more, even in the geopolitical and geoeconomic domain, which is what I'll be talking a little bit about today. I thought what I'd do is kind of give you a broader kind of overview of where U.S.-India relations are today, but particularly also how China is driving the relationship in ways geopolitical, in the technology domain, in the economic domain, that has been different from before and that is creating challenges and opportunities for businesses, American businesses, Indian businesses, the two countries working together, but also for companies in other as India puts them, like-minded partner countries. I'll start kind of with U.S.-India relations and then talk a little bit about China and then end how that's driving relations between the U.S. and India. And then I will talk a little bit about end with challenges, and then we'll move to Q&A. If you look at U.S.-India relations and where they are today, I always, and not just because we're in a history museum, but it is important to set where we are today in U.S.-India relations to compare that and to baseline that with, to create a baseline of where we're coming from. Because if you just look at U.S.-India relations today, people will say, well, things are good, but there are all these things that are not happening. And the reason I like to point out where we were 20 years ago is to talk about how far and fast by U.S.-India standards the relationship has come. So 2 decades ago, just to put this in perspective, there were U.S. sanctions on India. And this particularly affected things like export controls, technology cooperation in ways that people often forget today. But thanks to developments since then, developments I will talk about, U.S.-India relations today are closer than they've ever been before. You see this in the diplomacy space if you think about engagement. Before 2000, between 1947 and 1999, there were 3 U.S. presidential visits to India. Since 2000, every American president has, before President Biden, and I'll come back to that, has visited India, and President Obama visited twice. Multiple visits now regularly by Indian prime ministers to the U.S. The Biden administration has spent more time in its first year and a half in office than any previous U.S. administration has before. There have been multiple meetings at the leader level, both bilaterally between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, but also at the leader level with the Quad countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. Most recently, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi met in Tokyo for the Quad Leaders Summit and a bilateral meeting, and also India signing up, along with several other countries, to the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific economic framework. Just tells you the nature. It's not just a bilateral relationship, a regional one, as well as a quadrilateral one. There have also been over this last year and a half, several cabinet-level meetings and visits, and across the domain, not just in the defense and security space, or not just in on the economic side. And there are several dialogues between the two countries that reflect that for India, the U.S. relationship is probably one of its broadest relationships. Now, you have seen U.S.-India engagement not just, deepen in this diplomatic space. You've seen it in the defense space as well, where today the Indian military exercises more with the U.S. military than any other country. Defense trade has gone from almost nothing in the mid-2000s to nearly $25 billion today. In the economic domain, again, in the year 2000, bilateral trade was below $20 billion. Today, the U.S. is India's largest trading partners, with a trade worth over $150 billion. And India is creeping up already has crept up into the top 10 partners for the U.S. The reverse was always true, but that's happening. And then the investment relationship as well, I don't have to tell the crowd here, the U.S. is one of the largest, or U.S. companies are one of the largest investors in India, with increasingly Indian companies investing in the U.S. as well. And another thing I don't have to tell a group like this is the other elements of the relationship. The diaspora in particular, over 4 million today, people of Indian origin or Indian citizens who live and work in the U.S., but other dimensions as well. Tourism, students. There are over 400,000 Indian students in the U.S. And then one other factoid I often point out, because I think it's crucial for both the people-to-people side of the relationship and the economic side, is connectivity. Just a few years ago, not that long ago, there were no direct flights between the U.S. and India. And today, you actually see flights out of multiple American cities, whether that's San Francisco, Seattle on the West Coast, New York, Washington, Chicago, and soon potentially Dallas or Houston as well. And so you really are seeing kind of what this reflects is not just the depth of the relationship, but the breadth of the relationship. It also reflects the fact that the India-U.S. relationship sits atop at least 5 pillars. One is kind of the broader strategic pillar, which includes kind of the defense and security cooperation between the two countries. Second, an economic pillar, whether that's trade, investment, energy, immigration, education, innovation, and technology, of course. The third pillar is what one can think of as the global order pillar, not just the two countries working on specific issues in the international global domain like climate change, but also working increasingly together, coordinating in international and regional institutions. The fourth pillar is people-to-people ties, as the range of it, diaspora, tourism, cultural connect. And then finally, a values pillar with the two countries being democracies and having that link as well. Now, what this breadth of the relationship has done, and the fact that it doesn't sit atop just one pillar, but multiple pillars, is that it's created multiple and a diverse set of constituencies for the U.S.-India relationship across sectors, across the countries, in different states and provinces, but also across the political parties in the two countries. This is one of the few relationships that Republicans and Democrats agree on that should be improved. For perhaps sometimes they put emphasis on different aspects, but there is bilateral kind of or bipartisan consensus about the importance of India for the U.S. But the reverse is also true. Whether it has been Congress party-led governments in India or BJP-led governments, you have seen them want to deepen this relationship even further than the relationship they've inherited. And this kind of bipartisan support makes this relationship more sustainable. And even when there is friction in the relationship, helps manage those differences in a better way. Now, what has kind of been, these are kind of some of the facts of the relationship, but what has been the broader rationale on both sides for the relationship? For the U.S., India, and particularly for the U.S. government, as it thinks about India, it has utility, it has importance in the strategic, economics, and value space. In the strategic dimension is that there was a sense that as a rising power on the global stage, it was useful to be an Indian partner, to be able to cooperate with India in international institutions, that India would matter, and so its voice would matter. But also specifically for various U.S. administrations, whether that's the Bush administration, the Obama administration, Trump administration, and now Biden administration, for very different presidents, American administrations have seen India playing a role in contrast to China. Whether playing a role as a strategic counterbalance to China, an economic alternative, or a democratic contrast to China. And on that basis, these administrations have talked about supporting and investing in India's rise. There's also the economic dimension, where India has been seen as crucial in the trade and investment domain, as a market for U.S. companies, as a source of students and therefore innovation and immigrants and therefore innovation as well. And then, as I mentioned, kind of the values domain as well. For India, the U.S. remains the most crucial partner for it in terms of achieving its objectives of security, prosperity, and status. Prime Minister Modi has called the U.S. India's indispensable partner. And this is reflected across parties. So you've had the National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, from the former government, talk about and contrast he talked about India's relationship with Russia, for example, and we can talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. But he talked about that as an important relationship for India. But he contrasted that and said that the U.S., on the other hand, is indispensable and essential for India's transformation. But beyond that, for India, over the last few years, developments related to China have made the U.S. partnership even more crucial than it was before. I'll come to now the China relationship. India's concerns about China over the last 20 years have been a major driver of its relationship with the U.S. It's seen the U.S. as part of its balancing strategy vis-a-vis China. India and China have a range of differences, whether that's bilateral and not just the border dispute between the two countries, but also issues of sharing of the river waters of the river Brahmaputra, the issue of Tibet with the presence of the Dalai Lama in India, as well as several Tibetan refugees. Even in the bilateral space, economic ties, which, like with many other countries, were supposed to be a source of cooperation and where the area that was going to alleviate political frictions between the two countries, even those ran into headwinds a few years ago, with India seeing it as a very asymmetric economic relationship, not just in trade, but in investment, but also kind of people-to-people movement and labor mobility issues. Beyond kind of the bilateral space, India and China have also had a range of regional differences. China's support of Pakistan, India's other rival, have made India very concerned about China's and Pakistan working together against India. But beyond that, India has increasingly watched with concern China's growing investments and influence, not just in Pakistan, but in almost every one of the countries surrounding India, both its territorial but also its maritime neighbors in the Indian Ocean region, Sri Lanka, Maldives, etc. India is not so much worried about the economic activities that China is engaging in these countries per se, but the influence that is potentially translating to influence that China is often using to get those countries to do less with India, less with the U.S., less with Japan. And we can talk about that again in greater detail if you'd like. And then there's kind of a regional difference that overlies all this, which is that India talks about wanting to see a multipolar Asia where several countries have a voice and it doesn't depend on just power in terms of who is setting the rules. It believes, now we can argue the point, but Delhi believes that China wants a unipolar Asia dominated by China where Beijing gets to set the rules and others accept it. And so you see very different visions in India's mind of what the region should look like. And finally, on the global stage, India believes China is actively trying to stop India's rise and, for example, restrict its membership in various international institutions and its global influence. These were differences that India had even 2 years ago, or before 2 years ago. But the last 2 years, two developments have reinforced and even heightened Indian concerns about Beijing's behavior. Now, India is not concerned about China's rise per se, but it's really China's actions that have concerned India in the last 2 years. And it was kind of the 1-2 punch for the India-China relationship. One, India became increasingly concerned about China's approach to COVID. It believed that Beijing's lack of transparency made the problem worse, but it also believed that because China made an earlier recovery than other countries, it was then trying to take advantage of the situation, particularly in the economic space, where there was concern in India that Chinese investors would try to take over some Indian companies. Now, you can argue about whether or not that was going to be the case, but it did lead to some restrictions on Chinese investments that I'll come back to. The second area where you really saw, and this made a really big difference in the relationship, it has been a watershed moment, was the boundary crisis that started 2 years ago, that is still ongoing, but resulted in the first fatal clash between the two militaries in 45 years. The Indian government crucially seized China with those actions at the border where Chinese forces moved in 4 or 5 different locations to, as India sees it, unilaterally change the status quo at their disputed boundary. The Indian government saw Beijing as having not just made military moves, but having done so in violation of boundary agreements that the two countries had signed together. And so having seen that happen, the Indian government now believes that it cannot trust China to stick to any other commitments that it's signing, even if the two countries stabilize the border at some points. Because India believes that this has been, this boundary crisis has been in violation of signed agreements between the two countries, this boundary crisis has had kind of broader implications than previous boundary crises have. And it's made a difference in 5 ways, which makes it very hard for this relationship, the India-China relationship, to go back to definitely the kind of mid-2000s to late 2000s, where China and India were talking about kind of an Asia for Asians world, where the two countries would work together in the global domain to deepen bilateral ties and particularly economic ties. Even when Prime Minister Modi first came to office, he had talked about doing business with China, invested in that aspect of the relationship. But we're not going to go back to that time in the relationship for these 5 reasons. One, today, this boundary crisis has made a difference to the boundary deployments, the military deployments at the India-China border. There are more forward-deployed troops at the China-India border because Delhi is concerned that Beijing will try to grab more disputed territory in the future. Today, the line of actual control that separates India and China looks a lot more like the India-Pakistan line of control. Thankfully, without the shooting across the border, but nonetheless a more militarized border than before. The second way is that both countries have now changed the kind of their boundary infrastructure and capabilities, are at heightened level of tensions, and this creates kind of a trend of its own in terms of how close kind of the reaction time is now between the two countries. Third, what this boundary crisis plus China's actions around COVID initially has done is it changed the China debate in India. There was a debate in India, including with Prime Minister Modi himself weighing in on this, that economic interdependence, technology ties, etc., that interdependence would actually create stability. Now, India was not the only country who believed this. The U.S. did, European countries did. But the Indian kind of logic was, and the Chinese logic at the time, was that this interdependence would create stability because it would give both sides incentives to keep frictions managed, and that the two countries would actually focus on the cooperative side of the relationship. And that logic meant that the two countries should engage with each other and deepen that interdependence. Today, however, there's more concern in India that that interdependence is going to actually be a source of vulnerability for India, that it creates weaknesses for India vis-a-vis China. And so within the Indian government, the debate has moved. There is very little China debate in India, in the Indian government anymore. The debate in the Indian government is how far and fast to move with the U.S. and other like-minded countries to help insulate India from those vulnerabilities, rather than in terms of engagement, what the kind of difference between or the proportion of cooperation and competition with China must be. So you've seen the debate in India essentially about China change as a result of this boundary crisis. And that change in thinking about very little China debate anymore has meant that is led to a series of changes in Indian domestic and foreign policies that have longer-term or at least medium-term implications. On domestic policy, both the pandemic and the boundary crisis have led to a slew of measures on the part of the Indian government that restricts or imposes extra scrutiny on Chinese activities in the economic, technology, telecom, public diplomacy, and education sectors. This is not decoupling necessarily, but it is disentangling India from the Chinese economy and Chinese influence in certain sectors. On the investment side, you've seen restrictions. They don't name China, but you do see them say companies from countries that share land borders with India will have extra scrutiny on FDI, for instance. Now, unless you're the one or two investors from Bangladesh, this is really about kind of a China-focused effort. So restrictions on Chinese FDI into India, on trade, an active effort in India to reduce dependence on industrial inputs in certain key sectors, including electronics, solar power, as well as the pharmaceutical sector and some others as well. On the technology side, not just the infamous app ban, but also restricting and particularly imposing scrutiny, and maybe Nikhil Pavel can talk more about this from a perspective in Bangalore, but investment in the startup sector and tech sector, where Chinese capital has had a hard time in the last 2 years. On the telecom side, in January 2020, the Indian telecom minister was talking about letting Huawei into 5G trials in India. That is no longer going to happen thanks to this boundary crisis. And then even if you think about things like educational exchanges and kind of students, and there were several Indian students in China, this because of both Indian concerns as well as China's zero COVID approach has reduced kind of considerably. And you've seen somewhat of a human decoupling in a way that we hadn't seen before. Now, in some senses, this is an opportunity for everybody else because these restrictions on kind of Chinese activities will likely lead, and already has, to an Indian search for alternative, more trustworthy sources of capital, know-how, and technology. Beyond that, and who is it going to look for? And this comes to kind of the fifth reason why this is a different moment and has created kind of a opportunity for the U.S. and other partners. The boundary crisis between India and China, and India's broader concerns about China, have had an impact on Indian foreign policy in two ways. One, it has made India, for instance, and you see this in India's reaction to the Russia-Ukraine war, which I won't talk about here, but I'm happy to answer questions. But it has meant that because India sees Russia as part of its balancing strategy against China as well, it wants to keep Russia in the neutral camp and not take China's side as Russia-China relations get closer. But more significantly, India's concerns about China as a challenge has meant that it has needed to deepen ties over the last 2 years with what it calls like-minded partners, like the U.S. and other countries that share its view of both China's challenge in the region, but also the fact that of sharing the view that these partners need to work together, U.S., Australia, Japan, South Korea, the UK, France, and other countries need to work together to actually address the challenge that China poses across domains. And you've seen kind of a recognition on the part of India that these partnerships are necessary. Why? Because there is a widening military and economic gap between China and India. 30 years ago, China and India had economies about the same size. Now China's economy is over five times that of India. Its military budget is over 3 times that of India. So India has realized this a while back, but I think it's been reinforced even more that it needs partners. And in this, the U.S. has been critical. In terms of direct crisis assistance during the boundary crisis, the U.S. offered not just diplomatic support to India, one of the few countries to do so, but also military equipment and gear, as well as intelligence that was shared with India. India has also seen the U.S. is crucial more broadly beyond crises in terms of its China relationship, in terms of building India's own capabilities, defense, economic, technological, intelligence capabilities, but also building Indian resilience. As India thinks about its dependence on China and alleviating that dependence, it has also, as other countries have, moved to this kind of two-track approach of reshoring in some areas and friendshoring, working with trusted partners. And the U.S. has been crucial in both those dimensions in India's mind. You've also seen India see the U.S. as playing a crucial role, not just in building its own capabilities and resilience, but also in what we call in IR external balancing. The India sees the U.S. as a crucial actor in terms of shaping a favorable balance of power in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, to actually deter China from acting in certain ways, but also the U.S. and other allies, Australia, Japan, and others, U.S. allies, can help India offer alternatives and high-quality, high-standard alternatives in the region where India does not have the capacity to do so alone, whether that's in terms of regional infrastructure, digital connectivity, maritime security solutions, and in other ways. And today, because India sees the U.S. as playing this crucial role, you've already seen kind of a fundamentally different view in India of U.S. power and presence in its own neighborhood and in the Indian Ocean region. And that has made it do things like India joining, for example, the quadrilateral, or kind of not joining, it was part of it before, but agreeing to revive it and then elevate it and deepen the quadrilateral, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. Also accepting things like AUKUS, which is the Australia, UK, US military partnership, which India would have at another time actually been quite reluctant about and concerned about, because it brings kind of a military partnership into the Indian Ocean region. And India is also more comfortable with the U.S. working in its own neighborhood, whether that's a U.S. Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact with Nepal that will give $500 million of financing to that country, or signing the U.S. and Maldives, for example, signing a defense agreement. So you have seen kind of more broadly that strategic convergence on the China challenge, with U.S. concerns about China also growing, have led India and the U.S. to not just deepen cooperation, but manage their differences as well, including differences over Russia, for instance. You've seen, particularly over the last few years, a deepening of diplomatic defense and security ties, which used to be the area where India was most reluctant to work with the U.S. But whether it's in terms of defense, trade, and technology, with India purchasing considerable amount of military equipment now from the U.S., whether it's in terms of the militaries now operating together in various ways, India and the U.S. signing things like a logistics sharing or intelligence sharing agreements, whether it's in terms of military exercises, liaisons in each other's services, or communication and cooperation during crises, you're seeing a deepening there. You're also seeing kind of India and the U.S. seeing because they don't see the China challenge as just military or even geopolitical, but economic, technological, and even ideological, you're seeing that these two countries have come to the conclusion that they have to cooperate in other domains as well. So in these kind of different domains, but also with other countries. And that explains not just the quadrilateral, where you have seen two lines of effort. I'm wrapping up in 2 minutes. Seeing the quadrilateral, which has two lines of effort. One is to build a balancing coalition to be able to deter China from taking certain actions that would disturb the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, but where you're also seeing the quadrilateral work on what you can call a line of effort around building resilience in the region, building the resilience of the 4 Quad countries, but building resilience in the region as well. And so you're seeing Quad cooperation in a range of activities you can think about as economic security, where the strategic and economic and technological meet. Areas like supply chain resilience, areas like critical and emerging technologies, or, for example, even creating that next generation of innovation. There's a new Quad STEM fellowship that's just been inaugurated, and I can talk about if you'd like. But also areas like regional infrastructure, maritime security, resilience in the health and climate domains. And these are all now areas where the U.S. and India are working together bilaterally, but also with the Quad countries. Importantly, this is not just about providing alternatives, but also high standard alternatives, because this is not just about kind of the economic side, but about who's going to set the standards and rules. Now, I'm going to end very briefly, and I'll talk about them if you'd like more in detail. What are the challenges that there are going to be? There are going to be some challenges that I will spend a minute on, because I think it is related to the work all of you do here, which is in terms of as India challenges to the U.S.-India relationship broadly, but particularly as India thinks about this reshoring and friendshoring domain. On the one hand, it creates opportunities, including for all of you in this room. It creates more spaces for companies from like-minded partners, such as the U.S. and India, which are also in turn reshoring and friendshoring. India is looking to take advantage of countries like the U.S., like in Europe, doing these things as well by saying we can be that trusted partner. It's also led to the Indian government doing some rethinking on trade, and this has been one of the most protectionist governments on trade since the 1990s, but there is a rethink in India because of this reshoring plus friendshoring debate. But that also creates challenges, this kind of two-track approach. Even companies from like-minded partners of India can get caught up in the restrictions that India is imposing on Chinese entities, for one. But second, the question is, does this also lead to reinforce the drive for the Indian government to put its thumb on the scale for domestic companies, either for political reasons or for greater control of data, for instance, or to create its own national champions? And that will have implications for American companies. I will end with saying there are broader challenges beyond this kind of how India works out things like reshoring and friendshoring, including in the fact that economic and technology ties, which used to be the leading edge of this relationship, have now kind of come second to the strategic, the defense and security side. And you don't want to see a U.S.-India relationship that has one load-bearing pillar, which is the defense and security side. And what, in an ideal world, this economic side, this technology side, gets back to being at least even with that security side. There are also questions about, the Russia relationship, how the two countries will manage those. How they balance trade-offs within even their China strategies. And then finally, will the U.S. and India live up to the expectations that each side has of the other, whether in the geopolitical domain or in the economic or technology domain? So I will stop there and take questions. I can talk about what I've just talked about, but also if you have other questions about India, the India-U.S. relationship, I'm happy to do that. So I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, a little bit less. So what I'll do is I'll try to take a couple of questions together and then try to answer them as soon as possible. So let me I'll start here and then there, and then we'll come to this side, please.
A couple of questions, Tanvi. How does India's relationship with the U.S. affect the U.S. and India relationship with Pakistan? That's my number one question. And secondly, India's relationship with Russia. They're still buying Russian oil and everything, despite the fact of what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now. I understand the concept that we need to stabilize the Indian subcontinent. how do you see that working out?
And I think the gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name is Shrikant. My question relates to Brahmaputra and these serious water issues I feel that are not being adequately addressed. Going back in history and looking at what China did to the entire Mekong Delta, the United Nations was totally helpless apparently. There's a major destruction of the economies of Cambodia, Vietnam, and all those countries. If you look at that, I would like perhaps the U.S. can address that issue.
So let me start with those, and I'll start with the last question, because we've seen actually U.S. India discussions about the Mekong as well. So for those who don't know, the Brahmaputra River, as India calls the river, goes from to the Tibetan plateau towards kind of India and then Bangladesh as well. There's been concern, since China is the upper riparian, about its building of dams on the Brahmaputra as it's there, whether it is just in terms of the water flow, for one, both in terms of, too damming where there's too little water flow, but potentially also flooding if extra water is released into kind of India and Bangladesh. But the second aspect has been, so not just is what is kind of that management or building of dams going to do. Second has been this question of whether China would do river diversion. A third has been whether China could use its status as an upper riparian to actually put pressure on India, to use its control of the waters. Now, the one good thing that didn't exist in the case of the Mekong, which has also been the other river where these concerns have been raised, as you know, is that India and China did develop a mechanism where they share hydrological data. And so far, it has not been an issue, but you have had a kind of a concern in India that during not this boundary crisis, and we don't know because sometimes the governments won't release information about what is actually happening in the relationship, but in the previous boundary crisis in 2017, which was between Bhutan and India on the one side and China on the other, China stopped sharing that data. And so it was seen in India as China linking what should be an issue about natural resources and cooperation mechanisms that were worked out, that this would be used in a strategic way to put pressure on India, to send a signal on India. So it is a subject of concern. It is a subject, however, where mechanisms technically exist. So it's a question of trying to make sure that they are used. At the end of the day, though, there's very little that India can do to force China, because the legal mechanisms, I mean, you can eventually go, but in terms of the time frame. Now, where it makes sense for kind of India to do this is also work with Bangladesh, which does have better relations with China, because this is not going to be China can't hurt India or can't, divert water even for economic reasons or others, resource reasons, without also hurting Bangladesh. So this is something that is not just an India problem or an India-China problem, but also there's Bangladesh as an actor as well. So kind of using that mechanism to ensure. This also brings up the broader point of who has leverage on what. And one of the things India has been trying to do is ensuring it has its own leverage with China as well, and so essentially deterring China from using this as a tool. There are also examples from the Mekong example, which is sharing of data using kind of satellite imagery to get a better sense of what's happening. And so I think that's something you will see India do more of as well. The U.S. and India actually, and India separately, has a kind of a Mekong-Ganga cooperation initiative, but even the Quad is discussing the Mekong issue, and India has joined some talks that the U.S. and Korea hold on the Mekong as well, partly to learn and contribute as well in terms of resolving that issue, but also learning something from the Brahmaputra issue. So far it's a potential issue. It hasn't become a real one, but that is something that could potentially be a concern. On the issue of Pakistan and Russia, and then I'm going to take the rest of the questions very quickly in one go, so please put up your hands after that. I think on the Pakistan issue, you really have seen what people used to call it hyphenation, that the U.S. wouldn't do anything with India without thinking, how will Pakistan think about this? India used to have its own version of this, which is if the U.S. did do something with Pakistan, then say we will not work with you further because you're doing that with Pakistan. I think the U.S. and India have moved beyond that. You see, it's not that India and the U.S. are totally insulated from what happens in the U.S.-Pakistan or India-Pakistan relationships. But I think what you've really seen is India and the U.S. say, we are not going to let Pakistan be a veto point on the relationship. So if anything, today you have the opposite, where the U.S. is actually, anytime it does things with Pakistan, it is thinking, how will India think about it? There's a lot more communication. So when the U.S. is doing things with Pakistan, it is usually conveying that, so there's more transparency, which is helpful. I think the two countries don't realize they don't have the same view and vision of Pakistan, but it's a question of managing those differences and communicating over them. Having said that, the U.S. is often very helpful to India. For example, India, just last week, the U.S. and India jointly listing or trying to get a terrorist based in Pakistan designated at the UN, something China blocked, but working together on issues like counterterrorism and stability in the region. And right now, India and Pakistan are in a moment of stability. We don't know how long it'll last. But nonetheless, these moments make that issue less a point of friction. I think Russia is that larger point of friction right now. They're managing differences. They haven't gone away. Having said that, for India, the Russia relationship is partly important in this day and age, and it is a far less important relationship than it used to be 10 years ago, because 75% to 80% of India's frontline military equipment is still of Russian origin. They cannot, while they're facing a China crisis that could actually get worse over the summer, potentially next year, they are not going to say that we're going to cut off relations with a country that could potentially take China's side, stop the supply of military equipment to India. India just can't afford to do that. So for very practical reasons, whatever India thinks about the invasion, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had adverse impact for India in multiple domains, including push Russia closer to China, including inflation and commodity price increase, including putting at risk 25,000 Indian students or Indian nationals who were in Ukraine. So India is not happy about what Russia's done. It has criticized Russian actions, but it will not condemn Russia by name because it has, particularly in the defense space, these ties, which have shrunk over time as India diversifies, but is still crucial. And there are certain things that the Russians will provide India that nobody else will, including in the defense technology domain. Energy, very small part of India's might surge on oil. It's going to come back down because it doesn't make sense from an economic perspective for India to import large quantities of oil. But yesterday you heard the chair of the Biden administration's Council on Economic Advisors actually say it is helpful to curb inflation that China and India are buying Russian oil. And so, this issue on energy, I think, is going to come up and down in certain ways. India doesn't import any LNG from Russia, some coal, but still minuscule compared to kind of Europe in particular. So I think that issue is not going to go away, but it is, the trends are India's relationship with the U.S. and other Western powers, including Australia, growing, and relations with Russia much more one note focused on defense and much more much kind of on the downward, if not plateauing trend. So I'm very maybe we can discuss this maybe in Q&A, because I do want to try to get I hope the organizers will bear with me. I do want to try to get very quickly some of the other. I'll take these three and the fourth there, and then try to do kind of almost rapid reaction. Mihir over here.
Yeah. So I'm Mihir Parikh. I'm with Nishit Desai Associates Indian law firm. We talked about the negative side of it. Let's look at the positive. Two things. One is, of course, I want to touch on the economic and technology pillar that you mentioned that we should focus more or increase the load on. About 6-7 years back, when President Biden was vice president, he visited India and he gave a vision that, why can't we raise India and U.S. trade relationship to $500 billion, right? 7 years, 2014 or something, 8 years back. We are still stuck at around $110, $120 billion. What can we do, in your view, 3-4 things which can take us to this fourfold increase in maybe next 5-10 years?
Arun.
Arun Kumar. Tanvi, first of all, excellent exposition on the U.S.-India relationship. And I certainly second what you said about the fact that the economic conversation should not take second place to the security conversation. Now, my question is very different. So you've just come back from Singapore, from the Shangri-La dialogue. What was the mood there, and how do the conversations play with regard to the U.S. and India?
Hi, Tanvi. Just curious about India and its policy on cross-border data flows at the G20. That's been a sticky point from an Indian side, and I think the rest of the world is not very happy about it. How do you see that changing as India takes over the presidency of the G20 next year?
Here and more. Why aren't more women asking questions?
I'm just curious whether India is considering moving the weapon dependency from Russia to U.S. If it does, what are the impediments? Whether U.S. are willing to sell the advanced or not?
Brewer Stone Influence Partners. I'd be grateful if you could dig a little deeper into potential areas for cooperation around climate. Obviously, India's relationship with India seems all the more important given the challenges working with China. Both countries have their challenges on this topic, but be interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. If you give me 2 or 3 minutes, very quickly on, and I'll try to do the reverse. Climate, it's been a key area of cooperation. It became harder in the Trump administration because there was energy discussion. It moved to the fossil fuel space. I think you've particularly seen this in clean energy and clean tech. Where there is a lot of scope, and it's happening both in the kind of government-to-government side, trying to climate finance, green finance from the U.S., but you've also seen this on the private sector-to-private sector side, where, especially in solar power, you've seen You're also seeing this in the Quad context, or, for instance, the Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. It has all these, has this kind of money that it's still trying to figure out. But this, so far, this used to be the old OPIC or Exim Bank, which they've combined together. But the administration, the DFC, has a single largest financing project, was to an American company to set up and I think it's about, I can't remember what the amount was, but to set up a facility in India to produce photovoltaic cells to be able to reduce everybody's dependence on China in this space. So the idea is for the Indian market, but also for kind of other countries in terms of this friendshoring space, and we can talk about that more in Q&A. Weapons dependency, yes. You've seen, so just to give you an example, between about 2012, 2013, and 2017, India was acquiring, in terms of what it was acquiring, about 70% of its acquisitions or its spending on imports was Russia. It's between 2017 and 2021, it already come down to below 50%. So the trends are there. Most of the new platforms India is buying, the Russians aren't even players in, whether that's fighter aircraft, helicopters, naval, other things. So you've already seen that trend. It's not just going to be the U.S. because India doesn't want to replace overdependence on Russia with overdependence on the U.S. It's U.S., France, South Korea, Israel, even Ukraine was a major supplier for India. And so you are seeing kind of diversification. Plus, India wants to produce more at home. So it will be open to countries that will provide it good terms in terms of technology transfer, financing, being creative about that. But second, it wants to work with countries and companies that will help it develop its own indigenous defense industrial base. And so you're already seeing even American companies, Boeings and Lockheeds, they're not just selling things to India, they are actually working with large Indian companies to produce not just for India, but making the Indian-based part of their supply chains globally. I think Boeing has kind of over $1 billion worth of exports from India now. So you are seeing that, but it really will come down to, who's willing to. And it is not always an easy place to do business. And I think, there are some changes sometimes in the procurement rules, in the kind of, and even in terms of the co-development and co-production space. There is a longer discussion, but there are still some challenges in this domain. But the desire is to diversify as much as possible. Nikhil, I'll come to your question last, partly because we can always discuss this separately. Very quickly on the trade and in kind of how to build trade. I think the part of it is both India and the U.S. need to get back to a time where they actually think that trade is not a bad thing. And at the moment, both countries, neither country is in CPTPP, neither country is in RCEP. The U.S. is talking about digital trade. India wouldn't potentially be part of that discussion because of where it is. So I think needing to think now, rethink that we're not in a phase of deglobalization. We're in a phase of different kind of globalization. But I think India and the U.S. need to realize that we haven't moved to a phase where being concerned about what the world will do to you, but what the world can do for you. So I think, you can list out things like a trade agreement, investment agreement, just being more predictability and certainty. But I think it comes down to a broader attitude, which is trying to also convince publics that, this is not only going to be something that they're going to suffer from, but this is actually something to be competitive is a good thing. So I think it's a broader attitude more than anything. And I think the private sector has a huge role to play. I think the other thing that will help is as the two countries talk about supply chain resilience and working together on that will force a discussion on the trade side. And so even India will have to move away from saying exports good, imports bad, because you can't be, as you know, part of a global value chain if you're not going to let people import at a good cost. And then finally, and Nikhil, we will come back to the G20 discussion maybe during yours, but at the Shangri-La dialogue, I think one of the things was India was a bit missing, including the Indian Defense Minister not being there. But having said that, it did come up in several speeches and discussions. India is a partner that is wanted in the region, including by Southeast Asian countries, but also the Quad, which a lot of countries in Southeast Asia had concerns about. Less so of that, more kind of interest in what in kind of how the India can play a role in the region. The Quad can play a role in the region, providing public goods, but also maritime security. The Chinese Defense Minister also did bring up both the Quad and India. Talked about stabilizing relations with India, but saying the border dispute was India's fault. But on the Quad, actually talked about it as a challenge, as well as a new maritime domain awareness partnership as a challenge. I think with the U.S., there's clearly interest and less criticism of the Indo-Pacific economic framework than I thought. The Secretary of Defense gave a speech that wasn't, the Chinese Defense Minister's speech was red meat. It was coming out swinging from the start. I think the U.S. gave a speech that was at least initially much more about cooperation keeping the door open with China, but cooperation in the region and what it was bringing to the region, but saying not actually going to step back. So I think what was clear in the mood is the region is aware that there is a competition playing out, multiple competitions playing out. They don't want to choose, but even not choosing at the end of the day is a choice. And so I think you'll see gradations of what those choices are going to be across the board. Thank you so much, and sorry for going over.